Okay, this chapter deals with a little bit more detail regarding the functional areas of the brain. Okay, now cortical function, we already pointed out, is um, not symmetrical. Okay, um, there are some functions that are duplicated on both sides of the brain, but there are a considerable number of functions that reside only on either the right or the left side. Okay, while the hemispheres appear anatomically similar, okay, there is a difference in function, and lateralization is basically the way to describe this, right? That there is a function on one side that's not replicated on the other. Now, the degree of lateralization is different between men and women, and the reason for that is that there's a structure called the corpus callosum, which is basically a um, a layer of white matter that connects the two hemispheres of the brain. And in men, it's not as extensive as in women, which means that men have a greater degree of lateralization than women do. This is a sex difference, an anatomical sex difference, that is the result of differing levels of testosterone during development. And all it means is that in the event of brain damage in a region of the brain where lateralization exists, the likelihood of losing complete function is going to be higher in males than in females if it happens in the same region. Okay? It's not to say that one way of organizing the brain is better, it's just different. Okay? In most people, the left hemisphere is dominant for language, okay, as well as math and logic. So you might think of that as your analytical side. While the right hemisphere is designed for visual spatial skills, intuition, emotion, artistic, and musical skills. The hemispheres communicate instantaneously through fiber tracks and functional integration. The speeds are quite high. The connections between the two hemispheres of the brain through the white matter move at some of the quickest speeds that neurons move in the body, which is 250 miles an hour. Okay, so that's pretty fast. All right. Um, the white matter, as we've already discussed, is made up of fibers that project to different locations, and this is simply the way that information gets around the brain and ultimately gets from the brain to the brainstem to the spinal cord. The association fibers connect lobes in different hemispheres, okay, while the commissural fibers connect um, the different hemispheres of the brain, okay, and the projection fibers bring information down from the cortex and ultimately to the brainstem and the spinal cord. Okay, so they run in different directions. So anytime you see white matter, as you do here, think like these are roads or highways that get the information from one location to the other. Okay, and that's because this is primarily myelinated axons, which, as we know, is the outgoing electrical pathway for a nerve cell. Okay. Now, other regions of the brain include the basal ganglia, okay, which are made up of the subcortical nuclei, the caudate nucleus, the putamen, the globus pallidus. Together, the caudate nucleus and the putamen are referred to as the striatum. In addition, associated with these subthalamic nuclei, we have the diencephalon and the substantia nigra. The diencephalon, of course, is made up of the thalamus, the subthalamus, the epithalamus, and the hypothalamus, and the substantia nigra lies in a region of the brainstem known as the midbrain. Okay, functions include influencing muscle movement, controlling cognition and emotion, regulation of intensity of slow or stereotypical movements. It also filters out incorrect or inappropriate responses, and it inhibits antagonistic or unnecessary movement. Okay, so when we're talking here about the basal ganglia, okay, which is what these regions are, we're talking about areas of the brain that work together with the thalamus. Okay, one of the roles of the thalamus we're going to find out is to permit the execution of a motor program from the precentral gyrus, but also to direct stimuli to the appropriate region of the cerebral cortex. Okay, and to determine which stimuli make it to those regions. All right, so we have to have communication with the basal ganglia in order for this to happen, because these structures act as sort of a filter block to allowing those motor commands to move from the cortex to the cerebellum and the brainstem, and then ultimately to the spinal cord. So there's a communication between these elements that lets those purposeful actions occur, okay? And it filters out what you would essentially think of as noise, okay? Defects in this system produce unnecessary or purposeless movement, and makes it difficult to initiate or stop movements. This is one of the things, for instance, that we see in a condition known as Parkinson's disease, in which the substantia nigra of the midbrain dies off for reasons that we don't fully understand. And this, of course, is associated with these other basal ganglia functions. Okay? So just think of these as areas of deep gray matter that are designed to allow only the movements we really want to make to happen, okay, and for us to effectively control them. Okay. The diencephalon is made up of three paired structures: the thalamus, hypothalamus, epithalamus, and then there's another region called the subthalamus that's not actually um, labeled in this particular diagram, but it basically lies beneath the thalamus on the posterior side, okay? And these structures entirely enclose a cerebrospinal fluid-filled chamber known as the third ventricle. The third ventricle would be essentially between the two thalami, which look like heads of a mushroom, okay? So think of the brainstem as the stalk of the mushroom and the thalami as the mushroom caps, except this would be a double-headed mushroom, okay? And the third ventricle would be between those heads, okay, this area here. It's connected by the cerebral aqueduct to the fourth ventricle, and it's connected by the interventricular foramina to the lateral ventricles, which are behind this membrane called the septum pellucidum on both hemispheres. Okay? So, you can see a diagram of the thalamus here. See how I told you it was paired, it looked like the cap of a mushroom. The brainstem would be underneath it. Here it is pictured in purple. And then these regions are what are called thalamic nuclei. And again, these are just collections of nerve cells that have a particular common task. They don't look anatomically different from the material around them, but they are functionally distinct. 80% of the diencephalon is made up of the thalamus. It forms the superior lateral walls of the third ventricle. The nuclei are bilaterally symmetrical in this case, and they're connected by the interthalamic adhesion or intermediate mass. So you could think of that as the commissural tracts that allow the two thalami to talk to each other, just like the corpus callosum, or the main commissural tract that allows the cerebral cortex to talk to both sides. Okay. It has several nuclei, and they're named for their location, which project and receive fibers from the cortex. It's known as the gateway to the cerebral cortex because it sorts, edits, and relays ascending input, which is basically sensory information coming up from the brainstem and spinal cord. Impulses from the hypothalamus are designed for regulation of emotion and visceral function. You can almost think of the hypothalamus as a second brain in the sense that it's responsible, along with the brainstem, for controlling autonomic function, which is basically the unconscious control over our internal organs that helps us to maintain homeostasis. Okay. Um, Impulses from the cerebellum and the basal nuclei are designed to direct the motor cortex, to coordinate motor movement, and to filter out unnecessary movement. Impulses for memory or sensory integration are directed through the thalamus, and it also mediates sensation, motor activity, cortical arousal, learning, and memory. Okay, part of what we're going to find out about the thalamus is that it's one of the reasons that we fall asleep and wake up with changing light levels, because the thalamus, under low light levels, is chemically influenced to shut the gates of perception to the cortex. Okay, while under high light levels, those gates of perception tend to open back up, and we become aware of what's going on around us. And part of what goes into that is a hormone called melatonin, and a structure in the back of the brainstem called the reticular activating system. Okay? The hypothalamus forms the inferior lateral walls of the third ventricle and has many nuclei in it itself. Examples include the mammillary bodies, which are paired anterior nuclei that act as olfactory relay stations and as conduits for certain memory inputs. The infundibulum is a stalk that connects to a gland called the pituitary gland, which is in control of much of the endocrine system. It controls the autonomic nervous system, directing such functions as blood pressure, the rate and force of the heartbeat, and the operation of the digestive system, as well as the size of your pupils. It controls our physical responses to emotions because it's connected to the limbic system, our emotional brain. It is going to control our perception of pleasure, fear, and rage in biological rhythms and drives. And so this is the seat of what many of us call our primitive emotions. It regulates body temperature and controls sweating and shivering, so it's our body's thermostat. It regulates hunger and satiety in response to nutrient, blood levels, or hormone influence. It regulates water balance and thirst, regulates our sleep-wake cycle by utilizing input that comes from the retina, and by controlling the release of the hormone melatonin, which in combination with the reticular activating system controls sleep and wakefulness. Okay? The suprachiasmatic nucleus is sometimes called our biological clock. It's in control of the endocrine system because the hypothalamus either manufactures hormones that are stored and released from the posterior pituitary, or generates releasing or inhibiting hormones that influence the anterior pituitary. And as we've already indicated, the pituitary gland is in charge of the operation of much of the endocrine system. It controls the secretions of the anterior pituitary, and it produces the posterior pituitary hormones. The epithalamus is the most dorsal portion of the diencephalon and forms the roof of the third ventricle. The pineal gland is part of the epithalamus and extends from the posterior border. It secretes melatonin, which helps to regulate our sleep-wake cycle, and that is under the control of input from the hypothalamus and input from the retina. Okay? The brainstem has three regions: the midbrain pons and the medulla oblongata. It has a similar structure to the spinal cord, but it contains nuclei with white matter embedded. It controls automatic behaviors important for survival, and contains fiber tracts that connect higher and lower neural centers, as well as the nuclei that are associated with 10 of the 12 pairs of cranial nerves. Now again, nuclei here are clusters of nerve cells that have a particular set of functions, okay, and they share those functions. Now, I like to say that the hypothalamus and the brainstem act almost as a second brain. I would sort of say that it acts like our autonomic brain, in the sense that it's designed to um, control functions that we don't consciously operate, okay? Such as how our internal organs work, how our glandular secretions are made, and when they're made, okay? These are all things that it would be a nightmare to consciously control, so it's critically important that the hypothalamus and the brainstem always function. If they go out, that's going to result in your death, okay? You can theoretically live without a cerebral cortex, and there are cases on record of children that are born without cerebral cortex, okay? They just basically have brainstem activity, and they're not all stillbirths, okay? They don't do much cognitive function, but they can still live. Whereas if your brainstem and your hypothalamus go down, that's going to result in death, okay? You can see an example of the brainstem and the diencephalon here, okay? The brainstem is highlighted in green and the diencephalon in purple, all right? And what you'll notice, okay, is that a lot of the brainstem that we can see in this diagram is nerve tracks, okay? There are nerve tracks running up the medulla oblongata, nerve tracks running in many directions from the pons, and nerve tracks projecting up through the midbrain and down through each of these structures as well on the dorsal side, okay? There is some gray matter in here as well, right? The diencephalon on top, right, there's our cap, double-headed cap mushroom sort of structure, okay? We're looking at the front here. You can see the mammillary bodies, okay? There's the thalamus, all right? And you can see many of the cranial nerves as well. The olfactory tracts are not visible here because they don't actually run through the thalamus in order to get to their cortex. That's the only nerve that doesn't. But you can see the optic nerve, the oculomotor, the trigeminal nerve, the abducens, the the trochlear, the facial, okay, and so on. The cranial nerves are interesting because it's one of the few examples in the body of nerves that can either be sensory, motor, or mixed, meaning that in a mixed nerve you can carry information in multiple directions. In a motor nerve you only carry information out. And in a sensory nerve you only carry information in. In addition to that, frequently with these cranial nerves, a lot of the information is processed ipsilaterally, meaning on the same side of the brain that the stimulus comes in on. That's different from the nerves below it, which are called spinal nerves. All the spinal nerves are mixed nerves. There's 31 pair, and they start after the last cranial nerve, the hypoglossal, emerging from the intervertebral foramina of the vertebral column, okay? And then what they do is they branch and they anastomose, which is the opposite of branching, extensively before they get to their targets. And as a result, when you look in the nerves in the body, they can be any combination of autonomic or motor or sensory fibers, depending on the nerve that we're referring to. Okay? You can see it from the side here. This is from the front, right? And then this is from the back. Okay? Note the pineal gland's location. These four bumps here, the collicula, inferior and superior colliculi. Superior colliculi are relay stations for optic reflexes, and the inferior colliculi are relay stations for auditory reflexes. And you can see some more of the cranial nerves on the back. There is the fourth ventricle back here. And you can see the choroid plexus, which is where some of the cerebral spinal fluid is actually manufactured. There's a choroid plexus in each of the hollow chambers inside the brain. So there's a choroid plexus in the lateral ventricles in the third, and you can see in the fourth ventricle as well. Okay. The midbrain lies between the diencephalon and the pons. The cerebral peduncles are on the ventral side of the midbrain and contain the pyramidal motor tracts that bring information down the front of the spinal cord, and ultimately via lower motor neurons, peripheral nerves carry that out to targets, mostly skeletal muscle. Okay. The cerebral aqueduct is a channel that connects the third and the fourth ventricle. And then you can see here the midbrain, which has some interesting structures, some of which bear distinct color. Okay. So this is what it would look like if you actually dissected out midbrain. The periaqueductal gray matter, which is around the cerebral aqueduct, which you can see here, another canal that's filled with cerebral spinal fluid and lined with ependymal cells, is important in pain suppression. It links the amygdaloid body and the autonomic nervous system, and it controls the oculomotor and the trochlear nerve. The corpora quadrigemina are dorsal protrusion, with the superior colliculi being visual reflex centers and the inferior colliculi being auditory relay centers. The substantia nigra is functionally linked to the basal nuclei and is critical in, again, coordinating movement, filtering out movement that is purposeless, okay, and allowing us to initiate and stop voluntary movement with ease, okay. The reason that it has the color it has is because dopaminergic neurons produce dopamine, and some of the byproducts of dopamine production are pigmented. Okay, the red nucleus is a relay nucleus for descending motor pathways, and is part of the reticular formation. The reticular formation, as you can see here, okay, is a column of gray matter that has as one of its most important functions the control of sleep and wakefulness. Okay, so it's the reticular formation that controls the ability of the thalamus to open and shut the gates of perception, and this, of course, is enhanced by the production of melatonin. Okay, which shifts with light levels. In the pons, we have mostly white matter. Okay, the fourth ventricle separates the pons and cerebellum, which looks like a hunk of turkey burger under the occipital lobe of the brain. You can see it back here. The fibers of the pons connect higher brain centers in the spinal cord and relay impulses between the motor cortex and cerebellum. It also contains the origin of cranial nerve 5, 6, and 7, which are the trigeminal, abducens, and facial nerves. It also contains some of the nuclei of the reticular formation, which help maintain the normal rhythm of breathing, among other functions. Okay, so those are the pontine nuclei you can see here, right? Clusters of gray matter, again, reticular formation material back here. Okay, the pons and the medulla oblongata together, we're going to find out, control our breathing pattern. Okay, especially when we're asleep. The medulla oblongata joins the spinal cord at the foramen magnum and forms part of the ventral wall of the fourth ventricle, and contains the choroid plexus of the fourth ventricle. We saw that on one of the earlier figures. The pyramids look like two side-by-side baseball bats on the front of the medulla oblongata, and the decussation of the pyramids is where the descending corticospinal tracts cross from right to left and left to right. And so this is the origin of the reason that the right side of the brain controls the left half of the body and vice versa. Okay, so very important. Okay, most of the medulla oblongata is white matter. Okay, and there is some gray matter in the core. Again, periaqueductal gray matter here. Okay, and It is the most inferior portion of the brainstem. The inferior olivary nuclei relay sensory information from muscles and joints to the cerebellum. Cranial nerves 8, which is the vestibulocochlear, 9, and 10, which is the vagus, and 12, which is the hypoglossal, are associated with the medulla as well. Okay? The vestibular nuclei mediate responses that maintain equilibrium, and there are several nuclei, such as the nucleus cuneatus and gracilis, that relay sensory information. The gracilis relaying sensory information from the lower limbs and hips, and the cuneatus from regions between the hips and up to the neck. Okay? Functions for the medulla oblongata include its operation as an autonomic reflex center. A lot of the functions here overlap with the hypothalamus, and that's one of the reasons I indicated that the hypothalamus and the brainstem together help to operate the autonomic nervous system. The hypothalamus relays instructions through the medulla. Areas we find in the medulla oblongata include the cardiovascular center, which controls the rate and force of contractions of the heart, the vasomotor center, which directs the blood pressure and controls vasomotion, which is the movement of blood either to the periphery or to the core. Respiratory centers here generate the respiratory rhythm and help to control the rate and depth of breathing, along with the pontine respiratory center. So there's 3 areas that operate and control our breathing: the ventral and dorsal respiratory group and the pontine respiratory group. Additional centers control vomiting, hiccuping, swallowing, coughing, and sneezing. And you can see the medulla here. Okay, again, mostly white matter with clusters of gray. Okay, most of the clusters of gray are nuclei for cranial nerves. Okay, but some of it is, again, periaqueductal gray matter, the olivary nuclei, the solitary nuclei, and so on. Note the pyramids, okay, where the motor tracts cross at the decussation region. Okay. The cerebellum is 11% of our gray matter. It's dorsal to the pons and medulla and gets input from the cortex, the brainstem, and sensory receptors, and this allows for smooth, coordinated movement. The cerebellar hemispheres are connected with the vermis, the folia, or the transversely oriented gyri. Each hemisphere contains 3 lobes: an anterior, a posterior, and a flacconodular. The arbor vitae is the tree-like pattern of white matter that is deep to the cortex of the cerebellum. Okay, so it's deep to the folia, and you can see it here. Okay, the arbor vitae. Note the choroid plexus of the fourth ventricle right there. Right, cerebellum, fourth ventricle, and pons up here, just to orient you. Okay. Why all the ridges and grooves? Surface area again. Okay. The cerebellar peduncles are always ipsilateral. There are 3 paired fiber tracts that connect the cerebellum and brainstem. The superior peduncles connect the cerebellum to the midbrain. The middle peduncles connect the pons and cerebellum, and the inferior peduncles connect the medulla to the cerebellum. Okay, so what does that tell you? That tells you that the cerebellum has a link to information coming up from the spinal cord. It has a link to information going up to the cerebral cortex, okay, and it has a link to information that's coming in from special sensory organs like the eyes and the balance apparatus in the inner ear. Okay, so one of the roles of the cerebellum is to analyze the information that it receives from the precentral gyrus, compare that information to sensory input that it's getting from the eyes and the inner ear, and information from your muscles and your joints, and to make sure that they match up. And if they don't match up, what it'll do is it'll correct that information, send it back to the precentral gyrus, and will repeat the process of executing the motor action plan all over again. Okay? If we lose cerebellar function, one of the things that we see is something called cerebellar ataxia, where we have difficulty starting and stopping purposeful movement, and the movements tend to be rigid and poorly coordinated. Okay? Cognitive functions in the cerebellum include roles in thinking, language, and emotion. And its big role, as we just stated, is to compare actual with expected output and make those adjustments in the motor program. Okay? All right, I will join everybody in part C.